This is an essay that I posted on Substack 2 years ago, I think now. And I'm going to go through and read it out loud. And it will probably spark ideas about how I could make some points better. And I might talk about it more in future videos. Among conservative Christian cultures in America, therapy and self-help aimed at improving sexual relations within marriage has been available for decades. One of the most popular books in the field was first published in 1976. Footnote: The Act of Marriage by Tim and Beverly LaHaye. This fact alone disrupts the caricature of conservative religious culture that therapists make such a show of saving us from. Specifically, faithful members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have faced a profusion of media and personal services from therapists and coaches offering help with our sexual relations with specific consideration for our values and beliefs. Some of the prominent names in the industry have been plying their trade for 20 years now, though in observing the promotions and conversations taking place, you might have a different impression. Observing the court of LDS sex therapy reveals a rough division into different schools of thought. Do not expect that commonalities in faith and sexual values, let alone scientific evidence, will make for consistency in these therapists and coaches. There are some who take a more theological approach. In the midst of their sentimentality, they often give the soundest advice, reinforced with their own scriptural exegesis. There are others who philosophize about sex in a way that suggests the LDS component of their practice is window dressing, or a way of helping people leave the church. Some of them seem quite steeped in the values of the sexual revolution. Sex is to be redeemed from its biological context into a sport whose governing principles should assume engagement by interchangeable atomic units. Several of them seem to think that faithful Latter-day Saints who keep the law of chastity do so because it's the option we prefer to choose and a reflection of our authentic values. From a menu of sexual lifestyles in which, in their kindly progressive sentimentality, they treat as equally valid. That might sound enlightened, but it takes willful blindness to ignore the reality of where this leads if held aloft as its own light. And it takes a stubborn ideological zeal to try to hold this as in any way compatible with the demands of discipleship or the gospel. Such stubborn ideological zeal holds the gospel in second place of importance, not to scientific fact. That I could forgive. But to social trends, whose treachery is clear to the historical imagination. Ideological biases held and sometimes flaunted by therapists easily distort the anecdotes they favor. In fact, they lead to a penchant for horror stories, which of course make for the easiest scenarios to bring up every time another fawning interviewer asks another variation of the same old question. This low-hanging fruit reinforces a therapist's favorite ideology. Ideology thus becomes self-fulfilling within the therapist's aura of charisma and authority, and that helps the therapist's personal brand gain traction. Good business if you need steady clients. The more credit and charisma you can establish for your personal brand, the more readily people will hang on every word that you utter. This is the negative standard against which I judge LDS sex therapy. I expect better from those who presume to help me achieve a good sex life in the context of my covenants. Covenants that I take seriously, which ask sacrifices of everyone. In this essay I will sketch the more positive standard that I wish I could use. I will not single out any individual LDS sex therapist by name here. This is not directed against any particular practitioner, so then, #not all therapists. Any individual may or may not fit in some ways to the criticism I am putting to the whole enterprise. Though it remains unacknowledged in the courtly conversation between these practitioners on podcasts, their hierarchies of prestige are as obvious as the emperor's nakedness, a sweet irony to observe among those who cant so tirelessly of equality. Within a given school of thought, there are leading voices who formulate the doctrines, and there are the ranks of disciples who spread the spells of the stars, often through tiresomely flattering interviews. In general, therapists with the highest level of degrees in their relevant field should command the highest prestige, presuming that those relevant fields are based on scientific rigor instead of ideological trends. To become a psychiatrist, I have not found any of those in this field yet, requires something like 12 years. For a psychologist, a bit less. To become a therapist or counselor more or less cuts that in half. And as for a coach, I've worked as one kind of certified coach with training on the job. Since we're dealing with human beings, charisma remains a force to be reckoned with. Some of the women in the business are plainly making the most of their feminine charm to promote their brand. Well, why not? In fact, I wish the few men in the business would do their part. If a man is going to help husbands to be sexier in our wives' eyes, he might as well lead by example. How about some beards, maybe even a tattoo here and there? Pose in the woods with a flannel shirt and axe, or in a tailored suit leaning against a luxury car. The other guys do it. Charisma is powerful and beautiful, and some measure of enchantment in response to it is inevitable. When this happens, it's even more important to temper our own emotional response to the charismatic leader, to avoid either encouraging a cult of personality or railing against that individual. That's one of the reasons I refuse to call out any LDS sex therapist by name here. Anyway, my mistrust of the enterprise comes not from therapists' images, but from their words and how they use them. In their attempt to make reality fit with their ideology, some therapists engage in rhetorical legerdemain that is a wonder to behold. This leads to my first proposal to therapists to become more worthy of our trust and fees. Proposal 1. Use better language. Therapists, young and old, have moved onto social media to promote their services, and in the process they are being pulled into the logic of social media. To keep up the appearance of relevance and freshness, you must post often, and you must grab viewers' attention, often within a character limit. The frantic pace of these platforms makes careful measuring of words ever more costly, and rewards short attention spans, shallow thought, and especially forgetfulness. It's an environment that selects for some of the most dismaying behaviors of Mormon culture, and I use that deplored word deliberately here. The need to forget or ignore what was said 20 years or even 2 weeks ago, so that when we hear it again, we can pretend that we're learning something new. This may explain, but does not excuse, the reckless use of administrative incantations. A brief survey. There is no excuse to keep using intimacy as a euphemism for sexual relations. Yet therapists continue to do so with depressing regularity. Even those who take pains to name the distinction between these things will turn around and conflate them with reckless abandon when promoting their services on social media. It could be a simple lapse into habit, but I wonder how much to give them the benefit of the doubt in this, when vague and slippery language gives such ready excuse from having your ideas held to stricter scrutiny. Therapists assume a consensus. We all want intimacy in marriage, or we should, as long as it's defined right. They assume the consensus that marriage should be first and foremost about intimacy. Meanwhile, a reliable definition of the word eludes them. The cute folk etymology of into me see has made its way through the therapy and coaching industry like VD through an army camp. That's charming poetry, but it can't bear the weight of useful analysis that they try to load on it. Vulnerability is another example of poetry hijacked into jargon and then degraded into useless noise. Trendy psychobabble about vulnerability invariably has to rely on a quick follow-up of, no, not like that. In particular, the advice given to husbands to be vulnerable with their wives amounts to sexual sabotage. Desire. A therapist who is taking particular care and choice of words may distinguish between spontaneous, typically male, desire, sexual desire, and responsive, typically female desire. This is a crucial distinction that should be kept up with consistency. However, therapists consistently fail in this. No surprise, since keeping the distinction clear offends a certain conceit of equality. A reliable definition of equality is also elusive, yet people cling to the word and rally around it with an insistence that brooks no question. But the question must be answered at the start, whether you allow equality to mean symmetry and sameness. Therapists do this too often, reflexively attacking or dismissing even the most obvious facts of sexual difference. Then, when the coast is clear, they may well turn around and state those same facts as if they had just discovered them. Therapists use words like these out of their own need to be right. Of all the ill-defined sloganeering, passion may be the most reckless. It sounds exciting and sexy, so it gets laid on thick, like some filler ingredient of questionable chemistry, a tiresome advertising trick. As if by enough repetition of these magic spells, they will finally manifest what they failed to define. I chose my words deliberately. I believe in the power of spells. I also believe that there is one that we may call good, and there are innumerable imitators and pretenders to which my mind is not for rent. When people are so enthralled to authority that they actually go along with absurd ideas such as sexual passion resulting from equality, then their minds have been hijacked. Instead of the free use of a vernacular language, our common responsibility for competence in grammar and logic, we get administrative jargon and its authoritarian apparatus. To understand the power games that therapists have incentive to play, you have to keep in mind that the vaguest slogans can be the most politically useful. After all, why weary yourself with competence in grammar and logic when you can just turn to an authority to reassure you when you get confused? Another slippery word they use is validation. I like the definition found in the Church's Emotional Resilience Manual, at least as of December 2022. To validate people's feelings means to first accept their feelings and then to understand them. I dare say the best way we can love each other is to give validation while refusing to flatter, and that intimacy without validation is generally abusive. But some therapists define validation as flattery and oppose it to intimacy. It makes a radical difference whether you define validation one way or another, but I listen in vain for a clear, consistent distinction of this word from one therapist to another, and sometimes even in a single therapist from moment to moment. Listening to their advice, I have to maintain a constant vigilance. What was the real intent behind this word in this instance? Therapists could at least take the time to define their trade jargon consistently among themselves. They could publish a trade dictionary online by common consent and hold themselves to its definitions whenever they write blog posts or record podcasts. It would be a big step in the right direction. Proposal 2. Undertake consistent and rigorous statistical analysis of your clients and share your data. Imagine if, during their frequent interviews and podcasts, we could expect therapists to say, rather than "I think," "I have found, and here is how. In such a percent of the women I work with, in such a percent of the men, in such a percent of the couples, this happened. Here's how I gathered these statistics. This is my sample size. You can read the results of the study here. These are the questionnaires I use. You can read them on my website, along with the results of my research." To show themselves as more trustworthy, therapists should hold their teachings, their theories, up to scrutiny. Tell us how your pronouncements could be falsified. Show us your efforts to refine your practice to be more in line with the truth that's beyond any of you. If a therapist claims authority based on a credential that required any kind of published research, such as a dissertation, then the therapist ought to make that work readily accessible through whatever website or online platform the therapist uses. Some therapists have conducted surveys in which people may participate who aren't paying clients. Imagine if such sporadic efforts were done consistently and amplified into more consistent and rigorous data collection from a large group of practicing therapists, a corpus that grew in size and accuracy, freely available for research. This would guard therapists from resting on laurels and getting trapped in the echo chamber of their own pet theories and philosophies. It would keep prestige and authority in their proper foundations and discourage cults of personality. Of course, the samples they'll work with will be skewed overwhelmingly in favor of affluent American Latter-day Saints, a small minority of the human race or even of God's covenant people through space and time. That's a benefit, in fact. Accounting for the peculiar nature of your samples will give great opportunities for studying the interaction of culture and belief with human nature. There is sore need for more understanding of how Latter-day Saints live in relation to the law of chastity and the cultures that host us, spreading out from our American cradle. There is sore need for such understanding to be built on stronger bases than horror stories. Stronger bases are already available. Proposal 3. Ground your practice in scientific fact. In the opening of her formidable essay, No Law in the Arena, A Pagan Theory of Sexuality, Camille Paglia wrote, "Sex, as I have argued in my prior books, is animality and artifice, a dynamic interplay of nature and culture. To study it, one must weigh the testimony of art and draw on all the scholarly resources of the social and natural sciences. For the last 25 years, sex theory has been in a state of chaos. Single-issue activism turned into fanaticism on both the left and right. Understanding of eroticism has actually regressed as ideology has become paramount." That was in 1994. A generation later, the field of LDS sex therapy has not offered any LDS theory of sexuality with anywhere near Paglia's erudition and perception. In fact, the field seems almost proud of its foundations in precisely the situation she lamented. Our therapists show a disappointing lack of engagement or curiosity for art, history, or science, even in the midst of our current embarrassment of riches. I call for an emphasized attention to the natural sciences, particularly evolutionary theory. I expect that some LDS therapists would like to distance themselves as far from evolutionary theory as possible for fear of its godless materialism, while others, wishing to be counted as up-to-date, are eager to avail themselves of scientific authority to fight outdated ideas. I would challenge these especially to find within themselves the humility to allow scientific fact to contradict their wishful thinking. There should be no need to defend the utility of evolutionary theory to Latter-day Saints who wish to avail ourselves of all truth. There should be no need to deplore the state of LDS sex therapy either, but here we are. Put briefly, we owe it to ourselves as children of God, blessed with reason and the ability for self-awareness, to make use of evolutionary theory as our servant, for it offers us the sharpest and least flattering view of our weaknesses and the reasons for them. We keep our faith in transcendent intelligence, divine purpose, and the divine origin and destiny of the human soul, but we do so with our eyes open, and that means accepting the facts of human nature and human sexuality, and some of those facts are ugly. Acknowledging fact in its ugliness does not mean surrendering to nihilism. Still less does understanding the causes of immoral behavior in an amoral sexuality entail condoning such behavior, a point that evolutionary scientists are always at pains to repeat these days. Having tasted the bitter fruit of knowledge the evolutionary theory proffers, I cherish more than ever the story of a divinely made garden as a cradle for moral agents who find themselves having to navigate a lone and dreary world where the conflict between the sexes rages in exuberant, heartless fertility. Some therapists try to diagnose false cultural messages about sexuality. If they were to build their diagnosis on a foundation of current scientific evidence, I would trust it. As it is, I suspect that their criterion of truth about sexuality is determined by how they feel sexuality ought to behave. They do point out truths about human sexuality, but they stumble upon them piecemeal. From an evolutionary perspective, these truths line up elegantly as part of a whole picture. Or, merely from a scientific perspective, if evolution is too much for you to accept, then at least consider human biology as governed by the same principles as biology generally. To sustain and perpetuate life requires certain conditions, and sexual reproduction is a condition for living on this earth, even for plants. The starting point of two kinds of gametes forms the basis of a logic of problems and strategies that shape the sexual forms and behaviors of organisms in a state of nature. The human body as an earthly organism shares basic problems of survival and reproduction that are common to all flesh, and our bodies pass on unconscious strategies to solve those problems through conception, gestation, and puberty. For all the generations of humanity, up until the bounty of reliable contraception that we in the first world take for granted, human sexual behavior was governed by the logic of reproduction, which went hand in hand with a constant danger of untimely death. Reproductive strategies of each sex run far deeper than humanity. The pursuit mechanism of the male, spontaneous desire, and the selection mechanism of the female, responsive desire, in fundamental opposition. Our sexuality is a deep-rooted biological heritage, but our morality is higher than biological necessity. Therefore, sexuality presents serious obstacles to morality and forming healthy relationships. Each sex has mandates from their bodies which demand their due and yet must be curtailed, lest they lead to the ruin of individual and society. Even modern secular evolutionists can see the advantage of taming human sexuality to serve a more stable social order than human nature would produce if left to its own devices. Marriage is a taming technology, a divinely designed spoiler. It seeks to reconcile our innate conflicts, to school both sexes into a mutually agreeable arrangement of deploying the best and checking the worst of our opposing programs. This means that a project of liberation from social strictures to awaken the purity of our sexuality is only appropriate within grave limits. Therapy would be useful by helping men and women overcome sexual problems with the distinct approaches needed for each sex. To give due credit, there are therapists who attempt this. But there are also too many who show an aversion to admitting the asymmetry between male and female sexuality, unless it can exemplify the oppression of women. Sometimes, therapists tell men that we don't need to be ashamed of our sexuality, that we should make peace with it. That sounds promising, but they betray us all when they try to convince men that our sexuality is not what it is. The burdensome extravagance of attraction that forms the background radiation of our lives is not a corruption from wicked men or devils. It arises naturally in the male human body. If men free our sexuality from therapists' bugbears of should and obligations, our behavior won't come into better harmony with women's needs. Quite the opposite. Only a therapist who admits and understands this is worthy of men's trust. Those who don't may please keep their shows of concern and their backhanded flattery to themselves. Social conditioning calls on men to subjugate our biological programming. This is not the happy medium between indulgence and repression that women under the spell of equality may imagine. It is repression and frustration at the root. It has to be, for the good of women and children. That is how societies are built, from the beginning, on the understanding of this scientific fact. Male sexual desire is as cheap and gross as the dust. There is sweetness in it, but we have to refine it from crude black muck. What men crave so strongly is, by default, repugnant to those we crave to share it with, and is only redeemed by their consent. Women's responsive desire filters and selects men's spontaneous desire, thereby transmuting it from burden to blessing. Therapists tell women that they don't need to be ashamed of their sexuality, that as agents they should claim their sexual feelings and desire. That sounds promising. But they betray us all when they try to convince women that their sexuality is not what it is. They inherited their distinct side of the problems and programs arising from sexual reproduction, which go far deeper than humanity. If therapists admitted this, then they could base whatever charges of male malfeasance they see fit to make on something better than a therapist's individual antagonism. Conclusion. As the field of LDS sex therapy now stands, I find it hard to trust. An individual therapist here or there shows signs of intellectual rigor and even scientific savvy. Sometimes that's even paired with a steady devotion to the church and its standards. That happy combination tends to show itself in the highest credentialed. Meanwhile, among most practitioners, I find a depressing norm of reliance on fashionable social doctrines, even credulous servility to propaganda. Footnote. The Mormon Mental Health Association, Transgender Youth, dated April 3rd, 2017. As long as that statement remains on their site, I question the fitness of any member of the MMHA to presume to treat any sexual concern. I find therapists too easily and too often drawn into a particular frame of mind. In that frame of mind, therapists may wish to show compassion to men by discrediting the dark side of male sexuality as a false cultural message. They set men up. To be counted as a good man, buy into their flattery and do what it takes to keep up a convincing show of how they tell you a man at peace with his sexuality ought to be. That frame of mind grudgingly allows women's capacity for evil. But it is loath to admit that women's evil ever arises from their sexuality. In that frame of mind, the dark side of female sexuality is a misogynistic slander rather than a burden of nature that women must curtail in their own way. Haven't women suffered enough sexual repression already? If a therapist has the plain humility to hold as evident the truth that male sexuality is different from female, such a therapist should also freely declare that, as degraded male sexuality is intrusive, so degraded female sexuality is manipulative. But that does not serve the purposes of a prevailing frame of mind. I repeat, not all therapists go this way. What I just laid out is a type and shadow, a spell, and some therapists are more under its sway than others. Some seem to walk in circles at its edges. Is that balance or tactical advantage? And I've let some therapists off too easily. There is another frame of mind that clings closer to the mainstream of LDS culture. We might call it traditional, if we want to use that word in connection with something less than 200 years old. That frame of mind benefits from a more accurate view of human sexuality, mainly in that it accepts innate sexual differences. But it still misses the mark by attributing the dark side of our sexuality to a malevolent external force. Whether traditional or progressive in their attitude, LDS sex therapists share a refusal to reckon forthrightly with the realities of sex. Here is a challenge. Next time you listen to a podcast or interview with an LDS sex therapist, follow it up with an interview of an evolutionary psychologist. Maybe start with Carol Hooven or David Buss on modern wisdom. Listen to Mary Harrington, Louise Perry, and Nina Power. Then see how much higher we should raise the bar for our therapists. If they would command our respect, and especially our money, let them prove me wrong. Let them confront the fearful asymmetry of our heritage from the animal world with our conception, gestation, and growth into these monstrous, splendid bodies. Let them build on that foundation with an expanded appreciation for the wisdom and grandeur of God's design. Then they may share that wisdom with us far more usefully when it is needed. All right, well, thanks for bearing with that and its carefully crafted prose. As I said, I posted that some time ago, and there are ways that I might say some things different now. There are certainly some things that I might go into in more depth, and that will have to wait for another video later on. Meanwhile, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you later.